Hello, everybody. I haven't made an astrology video for a little while, so I thought I would do one. Um, a lot of the videos that I've been doing have followed a format that is basically um, listing off a certain aspect or transit, like Mercury retrograde, or, right today we've got Sun conjunct Saturn, that could be one too. But I thought for this video I would just do a general overview of the current astrology right now rather than focusing on any specific combination of planets, just to sort of take a look at the sky in general and what's going on, without focusing on just one specific thing. Um, it's February the 5th. It's Aquarius season. Um, so that stands out. Saturn is a ruler. Saturn is the traditional ruler of Aquarius. If you are the kind of person who prefers your astrology to use modern planets such as Uranus as the ruler of Aquarius, you can leave this video now because you will be severely disappointed probably. I am a primarily traditional based astrologer, and in my books, Saturn rules Aquarius and Capricorn. And so, basically, if you consider the fact that we've got a big lineup in Capricorn, we've got Mars, Venus, Mercury, and Pluto all there in the sign of Capricorn, a stellium, and then we have Saturn in its own domicile in Aquarius. That adds up for a very heavily Saturnian time. The fact that the sun is in Aquarius, the sun being the big bright light in the sky, puts a sort of a primary focus on Aquarius and Saturn stuff. Um, it was interesting in ancient astrology when planets were in their own domiciles. If you go with this kind of Platonic idea of like perfect forms, it's sort of like the planets, when they're in their own domiciles, are said to be stronger because it represents a kind of a more pure um, reflection, a pure manifestation of that planet and its energies. Um, when Saturn is in Capricorn or Aquarius, it gets the opportunity to be very Saturn like and to express its Saturn ways, how it wants to express it. Now, the thing is, Saturn is a malefic, which means that from our human perspective, it's not really the friendliest planet to be dealing with. Um, Saturn has often been described as representing a kind of a wall or a barrier or the process of aging, old age, and the limitations of when your body starts to break down and stuff like this. Um, I often also think of Saturn as having to do with boundaries. Um, from the perspective of personality astrology, people often talk about how Saturn, if you're defining who you are as a person, a lot of what defines a person is where your limits are, where I can go so far, but I won't go that far, or I draw the line there, or these kinds of things of putting down boundaries. And so I think you can sort of see it in a way in the news these days. I'm not following it that closely, but in the Ukraine, there's some tensions there with Russia amassing troops on the border of the Ukraine, and so maybe you can see some of that militant Mars kind of aggressive stuff coming through. Um, but it's Mars exalted in Capricorn, so it's a strong Mars as well. Um, and this stacked lineup of four planets in Capricorn, um, two in Aquarius. So I think the whole issue of boundaries and enforcing, maintaining boundaries, tensions around the borders, these kinds of things are very relevant for this particular Saturn season. And yeah, you can see that playing out as like on a geopolitical basis. Um, it could also have to do on a more personal level. Maybe in your personal relationships, etc. You might be um, having to say no to people, having to set some limits, having to enforce some boundaries. Uh, Saturn could also be a kind of an authoritarian, setting rules, um, that kind of thing. Now, I mean, here in Canada, we've had the protests of the truckers in the capital of Ottawa, and that could be indicative of some Saturn Uranus kind of protest kind of tensions. It's not really super tight actually right now. It's Saturn's 6 degrees away from the square with Uranus, so it's not like the tightest point of a Saturn Uranus square. Um, but Uranus is also making trines to. If you look at Venus in Capricorn is only 2 degrees away from a perfect trine to Uranus. And actually, one thing I noticed actually is if you let's skip it back to a couple days here, when Venus went direct. Okay, maybe it's longer than that. There you go. On January 29th, Venus stationed direct in a 1 degree away from Uranus, in a trine anyway. It's not a square, but 1 degree away from a trine, as the moon was running up against it. So February kind of opened with Venus coming into direct motion in this trine to Uranus. And also a good time to remind you that Uranus is in Taurus, which is a Venus ruled sign. So the fact that Venus is making the aspect and also has rulership over Uranus, kind of flavors the Venus retrograde turning point with a certain Uranian flavor. Now, remember, Uranus is about kind of disruption and trying to set free, trying to liberate, trying to maybe break out of old patterns, that kind of stuff. So there's Venus retrograde has ended in a kind of a moment that kind of favors maybe some kind of like creative reinvention, or changed the status quo. I mean, however, Venus isn't just there all by herself in Capricorn. Mars is there kind of sneaking up on Venus, to the point where if we skip back to where we are today, Mars is only 4 degrees away, and Mars is just going to be gaining ground as time goes on, because Venus is still moving pretty slowly here. When a planet stations direct, comes out of retrograde, it's sort of like making a turn in the sky, kind of going around a corner. And so it's not progressing along the sequential order of the zodiac very fast at this point in time. So there's a couple ways you can kind of gauge the strength of a planet. Um, First of all, there's certain like essential dignities, like Venus is what you call peregrine in Capricorn, meaning is it kind of a visitor. It's not at home in Capricorn, but not specifically in a difficult place. It's kind of neither good nor bad. However, if you can consider who Venus is sharing the sign with, you've got this lineup of Pluto, Mercury, Mars. Of those planets, Mars is exalted. So Mars is a lot stronger than Venus in this position. And Venus is coming into conjunction with Mars. So the all the with conjunction and sharing the sign means these things all get kind of blended and blurred together. But the Mars in Capricorn is a kind of a more potent flavor, a more kind of stronger thing that kind of will overpower Venus. And so the kind of the friendly face of Venus, the peacemaker, may, you know, that may kind of fall to the influence of Mars there right beside it. Mars is much stronger because Mars isn't in a retrograde. Mars is moving in forward motion, approaching Venus in exaltation. And also if you look at the ruler of Capricorn, Saturn, is well dignified in its own sign. So if we look at what's strong here, basically the two malefics, Saturn and Mars, are actually both very strong. And as I was saying, Saturn about saying no, about putting on limits, enforcing boundaries. Venus is about bringing people together. Mars, I would say, is generally about separation, about cutting, cutting the ties that bind and all this kind of stuff. And so I don't necessarily think it's the best time to be trying to make peace and come together and settle the differences. If anything, it's like the planets, I would say, are more conducive to maintaining boundaries, setting boundaries. And I mean, maybe it can remind you too that Aquarius is a fixed sign. So, and Saturn's right in the middle of Aquarius, 16 degrees. It's just, 15 would be the middle. So but yeah, right, pretty much square in the middle of Aquarius. We still got a good, another year and a half of Saturn and Aquarius. Fixed signs like to basically take what's been established and keep it going, maintain it. And so it's much more about maintaining what's already there, whereas the tension with the Uranus square has been to sort of shake things up and kind of revolutionize things. The Saturn influence is more about a conservative attitude, about conserving what has been established. I think there's some interesting things about Aquarius, though. If you consider that it is it's a yang sign, it's an air sign, and there is something kind of optimistic about Aquarius in that seasonally, we're in the middle of winter, but the days are getting longer, the sky is getting lighter, it's getting more sunny out, and there's a kind of an attitude that it's still cold, it's still very wintry, but that we know that things are kind of headed towards lighter, brighter days. And so I think there's a sense of optimism that comes with the sun in Aquarius, marking it being Aquarius season. But the optimism here may not necessarily budge to changes or to what can I say? It may be kind of rigid and inflexible because Saturn is a kind of Aquarius, first of all, is a fixed sign, and Saturn is known to represent things like bones and structure and order and stuff like this. And so, for better or worse, those kind of things are at the forefront right now. And with the Capricorn lineup, it's almost like, because all those planets are in a Saturn sign, it's almost like Saturn is enlisting this big team of planets to do Saturn work, right? That's the kind of order on the menu right now, is to fulfill Saturn stuff. And yeah, I think that's a kind of overriding influence these days. Saturn, of course, can be a bit of a drag, being the greater malefic. I mean, it kind of stands for things like depression and isolation and withdrawal from society. Like the hermit, I feel, is a very Saturnian kind of character. Saturn can be kind of like the outsider. Um, and so I think there could be things to do with this. Saturn may kind of point to where we kind of feel like we don't fit in, like where we're running up against our own limitations, where we're not, you know, we feel separate and isolated and all these kinds of things. But I think there's also maybe a benefit for, the hermit is a very contemplative kind of figure. There's certain things that, like, if you're on the other side of the boundary, there could be a certain outsider experimental attitude that could even come with Saturn, right? That you're kind of beyond the realm of what's normal, and therefore there's room to experiment on one side of it, whereas on the other side, Saturn may also have to do with confining oneself into a certain category and feeling the need to maintain the definition of that category and kind of stick to those kinds of preformed conceptions without much. So, I mean, Saturn can be, in a way, either inside the convention or outside the convention, depending on how you're relating to it. There's different sides to Saturn. At the same time, here we also have Jupiter in Pisces, and which is an interesting one because Jupiter is in its own domicile as well. So if we look at this big the lineup that we've got right now, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars are all well dignified by essential dignity. And these are the three traditional outer planets. Outer as meaning farther away from the sun than the Earth is. Whereas if you look at the inner planets, Venus and Mercury, they just both came out of retrograde. So they are in a weaker position. I mean, it's better to be in direct motion rather than to be retrograde, but the thing is, they haven't picked up speed yet. They're still kind of just coming out of the transition from retrograde to direct motion, and they're still moving very slow, and that weakens them. Whereas the other planets are in direct motion and well dignified. So there's this general thing where for Mercury and Venus stuff is still kind of weak, I would say, based on the slowness of the retrograde. Like the actual backwards time is over, but we haven't built up any momentum in the other direction yet. That said, however, when Venus just comes out of retrograde, Venus is very bright in the sky because it's retrograde brings the planet closer to Earth physically. And Venus is almost a whole 30 degrees away, not quite. I guess that would be like 26 degrees. Am I doing my math right? But Venus, the point is Venus is completely out from under the beams of the sun right now, which also factors into increasing the visibility of Venus. So while Venus may not be progressing through the zodiac very fast, Venus is very bright in the sky. So in some ways, Venus is actually a pretty strong influence, but it's an influence that is strong, but blending in with this Mars stuff, as I said. So there's maybe a certain type of aggressiveness or a certain type of, I don't know, what can I say? I think with Capricorn too, you got to look at the practical details where I think Capricorn is more of a no nonsense sign. The Saturn ruled influence is there, and it's looking at the kind of like the brass tacks, the details, which may have less to do with what's emotional considerations. Might not be factored in as much. That would be more of a water influence. Social influences may not be factored in as much. That could be both water and air. Earth is more to do with the basic material practicalities, and um, so that kind of Mars, that militant Mars, is not. Yeah, it's kind of taking things at a more serious angle, I would say, and the whereas Venus might appreciate things which are more, fun and just nice and kind of pleasing. There may be more of a sense of maybe serious business with that Mars influence on Venus, where it may not be the most light-hearted time, basically. Um, there are some other things about Mars and Venus. Like I noticed that the astrology podcast mentioned this stuff about Prince Andrew and the scandals with Epstein and the whatever pedophilia, sex abuse, and all this kind of thing. And to be honest, when I was trying to do research on my own before that podcast episode came up, I actually noticed this stuff myself. It's also interesting because not only does Prince Andrew have a Venus Mars conjunction, but it's in Capricorn, just like we're having now, and it's also in the later part of Capricorn. So the stuff with Pluto and also the Mercury retrograde with Pluto was hitting his Venus Mars conjunction, and it all works very well for the scandal and all this kind of stuff. But I don't know. Like I didn't really want to spend a lot of time. I don't like. I'm right now. I'm not making any money off of doing these astrology videos, aside from like I make money when people pay me to do natal chart readings. So aside from these videos that I'm doing, acting as a kind of advertisement, I guess you could say, to let people know that I am still doing astrology and that I can do a natal chart if you want, or even other kinds of charts, but natal charts are the most popular. That's how I make my money, and so I don't necessarily like, you know, spending my free time uh, talking about pedophilia and corruption and all this kind of stuff. I may notice it in the astrology, but I'm not sure if that's really how I want to be spending my time during my videos, just talking about all this kind of stuff. I I got my training from a Chuta, who goes as far to say that he doesn't even look at the news at all anymore. Um, and it was a bit tricky being an astrologer because like you're looking at the astro weather, but you're not looking at the news and stuff. I'm not sure if I'm quite. All right, you have to excuse me there. My For some reason my software had a hiccup and my iPad stopped recording, but I'm back. But yeah, I was just sort of talking about how there's certain things that may be going on with astrology that I can see, and I can see matching up with certain current event stuff. And it's a conflict for me because on one hand, I don't know if I entirely agree with the attitude of like completely tuning out everything going on in the news that's going on in the world. That I mean, I can understand that maybe if you're really upset by things happening in current events and stuff, and just by if it's stressing you out and it's not helping and stuff like that, then yeah, maybe it's a good idea to take a step away from the news. But I'm like, I don't know. I personally I have an attitude more like if my own sense of peace and well-being is dependent on me switching off what's happening in the world and not paying attention to the world that I'm living in, then that sort of seems too much to me like ignorance is bliss than it is, you know, bliss from being aware about things, right? Like I, I mean, the Buddhists have this idea of the great perfection of everything that, like, in spite of all the problems in the world, things are at some level essentially perfect. But if you have to, if you can only have that sense of perfection by looking the other way with all this shit going on, then what kind of a sense of perfection is that, right? Like, is that really, how transcendent is it if you have to turn a blind eye to all these problems, right? But I mean, that said, I don't really want to spend, like, why would I spend more, I'm not like a QAnon freak. Why would I spend all my time obsessing over whatever elite pedophilia rings or something? Like, I've got other things to do with my time. Like, I'm not trying to dismiss that it isn't a problem or anything. It's just not what I want to spend all my attention on. I like, I I have a passion for, I find astrology to be pretty cool, but it connects with a lot of stuff, right? You can connect it to all sorts of things going on. That's what makes it cool, but that doesn't mean that everything it connects to is necessarily what I want to spend my time on. Um, but I mean, it's also interesting because it opens up some interesting philosophical questions, though. In that, if the astrology works so well for something like Prince Andrew getting busted for being a creepy pedophile and being in bed with Epstein and all this kind of stuff, it sort of leads the question to, like, what does it mean that all this stuff is fated, basically? Because if it shows in the stars and it shows on the guy's charts that this is all works really well with astrology, it's sort of like, what does it mean that was that all this stuff is predetermined, that, like, it's all these terrible things happen, but it's like in the cards, it's like it's foretold in the stars that rich and powerful people would get into scandals and have these problems happen. Yeah, I mean, it is a bit funny because it's like, in especially as for somebody like me who runs a, I named my channel Divine Timing, and a lot of the time when I make these videos, I'm kind of like, well, hold on, a lot of this stuff, like the Prince Andrew stuff would be considered to be the opposite of what people would consider to be divine. It would actually be quite unholy and, devilish even by definition, and yet that is very applicable with astrology, and you can see it playing out, and so it's sort of like, I mean, but the astrology itself doesn't necessarily justify things by any means. It doesn't say that it's like okay that everything, or does it? I don't know. These are some. I mean, like but I mean, as a society that where it's our job to instill whatever, maintain justice and law and order and hold people accountable for their actions. We don't give people a free pass just because the astrology says it's going to happen or something like that, right? You still have to be responsible about it. Anyways, I don't know. That's just a tangent anyways. But these are things that are in the news that are matching up pretty well with the astrology. Specifically, when you talk about Pluto and the power differentials and the secret underbelly world of darkness coming to the surface and all this kind of stuff. And if you if you haven't had enough of that already, if we keep progressing things along here, look what's going to happen. Not only do we have Mercury hitting Pluto again, but eventually you have Venus and Mars coming up to Pluto here into a triple conjunction, and that will be March 2nd. So about a month away, I consider this a kind of a grand finale to do with a lot of this Pluto stuff, having Venus, Mars conjunct Pluto. A lot of the more, we're talking about the the Mars militant, aggressive, assertive kind of quality, when that gets combined with the desiring quality of Venus and perhaps the obsessive, dominating quality of Pluto, um, it could be quite the combination to have all these things combining in the sky in a conjunction, with Mars being the one in the best dignity, being exalted in Capricorn. At the same time, it's also kind of interesting that we have a new moon and we have Mercury conjunct Saturn. I mean, this is all for a month away, though, so I'm not going to spend that much time on that right now. But that's some interesting astrology coming up. But let's go back to where we are now. Yeah, it's that Capricorn lineup. That's where all the action is right now in astrology, with the Saturn stuff, with this Capricorn stuff. So I'm not going to do it here doing a horoscope style, but if you look to where Capricorn and Aquarius are in your whole sign houses, that'll give you a hint to where all the action is going on with astrology these days. I also started to talk, I didn't really get into this yet, but Jupiter is in Pisces. And I don't want to just copy the astrology podcast, but I thought it was interesting that they were talking about Jupiter standing more for expenditure of money, to explain why there's a lot of financial downfall happening when in a year where Jupiter is in a good condition. For example, Mark Zuckerberg just lost like $30 billion or something like that. Apparently, there was a big Bitcoin crash a while back as well, that they were associating with this. I made the point that that Jupiter was squaring the nodes when it entered into Pisces, and that squaring the nodes from that position of Pisces relative to the South Node being at the end of Sagittarius at the time, that was what you call a self-bending position, which has a kind of a sense of loss around it. I'm also kind of wondering if the Neptune influence on Jupiter may have something to do with a kind of a loss and dissolution. Because the way I look at Neptune, there's something about it that is like, it stands for a sort of like a kind of a vulnerability in a way, where people talk about in the saint and the sinner with Neptune, that there could be something divine and holy and idealistic, and then also something that's maybe corrupt or poisoned or polluted about Neptune. But I think a lot of it has to do with in Christianity, they would say that we are all sinners, and you have to repent, repent your sins and have redemption and all this kind of stuff. Liz Green's book, Neptune, The Journey for Redemption, talks about this. And so I think with Neptune, there is sort of like, there's this idea that there's a certain spiritual sense of like having made a mistake or have done wrong, but asking for forgiveness and asking for redemption, and in a higher spiritual way, that's like there's it's like you're trying to correct your behavior to go with the ideal that, like, you recognize all these things that are wrong with you. And I think that Neptune kind of can bring that out, like the sort of sense of feeling sorry for yourself, or, wow, I really messed up. Wow, I'm really a mess. And then, but like, you're kind of in a devotional sense, sort of praying that your mistakes, that you see that I realize my mistake and I will do better, and like, please forgive me, and all this kind of stuff. Like, I think that Neptune brings in those kind of qualities to, especially when Pisces, you've got that kind of emotional kind of thing where it's, that goes with maybe shame or like looking for forgiveness and all this kind of stuff. And that Neptune influence, with Jupiter, there could be some good opportunities for being forgiven and all that kind of stuff. As a side, it's kind of interesting. As a side note, I was thinking about I read a lot of Byung-Chul Han these days, and he has an interesting idea in his book called The Agony of Eros, where he talks about being able not to be able. Um, and he kind of illustrates that idea in terms of being forgiven for a debt, right? Where he says that one of the problems with modern day capitalism is that if you rack up a huge debt, there's our society doesn't really forgive people for debts, but they default on debts and they go bankrupt and stuff like that. Or you send the collection agency to collect, repossess all your belongings or stuff like that. But we don't have this thing where we can really just wholly forgive somebody. Say like you really messed up here, you're really in the hole, you really owe a lot of money, but we're gonna forgive you. We're just gonna write it all off and that kind of thing. And that's what Byung-Chul Han talks about as the being able not to be able, where we have a society that puts ability or ableism front and center, where we don't allow, I think, unless you have sort of, maybe, let's say, you have an argument for certain forms of like social welfare. Personally, like I'm on a disability benefit, for example. There's certain things like that our society does that gives some people, that forgives people if they're not able to meet a certain standard, that they're given the allowance to be able not to be able, basically. And I think that could work with Neptune, that sense of forgiving, that sense for coming up short, but there being a kind of a benevolent, merciful, kind of compassionate attitude that doesn't that allows something to be as it is, and isn't just like, doesn't have this sort of like severity about, you must conform with these expectations or else, right? Like, and I think that Jupiter being the greater benefic, when you put it together with Neptune, could kind of bring out that kind of stuff. But Jupiter, as they say, is about spreading the wealth. It's maybe about an expenditure of money more than saving the money. So it could be like Jupiter and Neptune could be like forgiving the debt, but Jupiter takes a responsibility for absorbing the debt, for taking the hit in a way, in that act of compassion and forgiveness and all that kind of stuff. It may not really be good for business. It may not be something that's good for the economy necessarily. It may not all be about making money, about growing and being productive and overcoming the problem. It may be more about kind of an acceptance of it, perhaps, right? And so it's a different kind of a value system, perhaps, that we could illuminate with Neptune and Jupiter. I don't know. That was just something that came to mind, anyways, as I was trying to think about what this Neptune influence here really means. I think that's basically it. I'm not going to get too much into the stuff about like whatever what the moon is doing today, because I'm looking more of an overall kind of overview of the astrology. But I thought I'd check in and just sort of share my thoughts about the general outlook of astrology this time of year. And if you like these videos, you can like and subscribe, or tell me encouraging things to motivate me to keep going. As I think the Saturnian, that whole kind of Saturn thing recently has been, yeah, I don't know. I've felt the sort of the heaviness, perhaps, of Saturn. That lead weight heaviness has been a kind of influence, and I haven't really been that motivated in astrology as usual. I won't spend too much time talking about it, but I bought a new piece of music gear recently, and just making sounds and expressing my creativity in that way has sort of been feeling more appealing to me than trying to grind it out with astrology and stuff. And yeah, I don't know, my astrology business wise, like I haven't been getting a lot of work ever since I got fell ill. And so if you would like to support me in my astrology business by asking for a reading, I'm well, I don't know. I haven't done a natal reading for a while. Since I've been recovering my health, it's been relatively slow around the office here. So, if that is something that you're interested in, um, I can brush off my natal reading skills and I can look at your chart. Hit me up if that's something you might be interested in. Um, yeah. Anyways, thanks for supporting my work.